Hi everyone. This quick video recording, I hope it's quick, is going to walk us through the presentation that was given on Monday of in-service while you were at your AVID critical reading pathway. So just wanted to let you know what you missed so that you don't feel like you were left out. Just so you know, on Tuesday when you were at AVID pathway training, it was meetings, and that is what we'll discuss in our meeting next Tuesday. So let's dig in here to the presentation that Brian and I did. So what we wanted to do is we really wanted to capture what the work of the PLCs were last year and then what the work is going to be this year in PLCs. And so Brian talked about and just revisited the 4 questions that drive the work of a PLC, which is determining what we want our students to learn. How will we know if each student has learned it? How will we respond when some students do not learn it? And how can we extend and enrich the learning for students who have demonstrated proficiency? This is all leading to that guaranteed and viable curriculum for all students, that we're making sure that students don't get certain things by choice and chance of the teacher that they have, that they're all getting that same learning. So last year the focus really was on that first question: what do we want students to learn? And the work that we did in our PLCs was creating those learning targets, and then using those learning targets with students. So in the process of determining what do we want students to learn, we prioritized our standards and really figured out what those big rocks were in our classes. And that's where we should all be at with our unit plans at this point in time right now. And then be communicating those learning targets that are agreed upon with our students. Now, I literally snipped this from our presentations that we did last year, so you've already seen this stuff, and I'm not going to go through it with you again. So then we celebrated the work that we had done last year, and everyone got into groups and shared their best unit plan that they had done with learning targets, and people were able to learn different ways that people are using the unit plans and different layouts and structures and formats that they're using to all get at that big question of what do we want students to learn. So that piece kind of looks something like this if you take a look at the things that we had them do when they got into the groups. So they picked somebody from another content area, they talked about their unit plans, and then we had a little reflection basically on what happened. Then we moved into talking about this year's focus. And this year's focus is that second part of the unit plan, and the second question of what is the work that a PLC does. And that is, how do we know that students have learned what we wanted and intended to teach them? And so the work in the unit plans is going to be completing this section, but it's not so much the paperwork here that's important, it's the process that's important. The process is really making sure that our assessments are aligned to the targets, that we're actually assessing a student on what we taught them and not anything else. So the structure doesn't really matter, it's really the process here. Now, I put these things in place because this is what makes sense in my brain for how to make sure that my assessments align to my learning targets. If you take a look, this would be making sure that there's a practice assessment, a formative assessment, and then that this learning target is also on the summative assessment, depending upon how many learning targets you have. And some people said, well, I have a ton of learning targets. There's no way that I could put a table in that would even be beneficial for me. So then we talked about how, well, maybe your unit goals are something that you put in here to make sure across the top, to make sure that you have a practice, a formative, and a summative for all of them. You can structure this how you want it to look, layout-wise. The point here is that you're doing something that shows that here's what I did for practice for this learning target or this unit goal, here's what I did formatively, and here's what I did summatively. But before we keep going, I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page with assessment language. So when we're talking about practice, we're talking about you've taught some new information to the students, and now you're giving them that first practice with it, all right? That first opportunity for students to show if they understand the new learning that you've taught them. Oftentimes, teachers will use this opportunity as a collaborative opportunity with students because it's that first time that they're really playing with the material that you've taught them. Then, we want to create opportunities for students to have formative assessments where they're individually assessed to provide us with information. The information that we get from that assessment tells us the students get this, I can move on to the next learning target, or I need to go back and reteach. But it also provides the student with feedback on where their learning is at and helps to either solidify connections that they've made in their brain or helps them to break those connections and form new connections. So that's the reason behind the formative assessment. It's supposed to help improve student learning, not so much that we're getting something in the grade book. And then summative assessment is designed to provide information to make a judgment on where that student learning is at that particular point in time in instruction. So this is measuring that learning and then putting that grade in the grade book, if that makes sense, so that we can communicate where that student learning is at. We have to, as educators, see assessment as something that we use in the learning process, and it's not something that takes up a day or time during our day. It's an integral part of that teaching and learning process. So when we think about it, practice and formative assessment support the learning, whereas summative assessment certifies the learning. And we can actually use our win time if we feel the need to take the data that we get from formative assessment and say, hey, there's this group of kids who really didn't understand this learning target. I can bring them in during win time. We can relearn something, and then they're going to be ready to move on because we've done this relearning. And that's the power on top of all the other great things that we can do during win time, but having that time set aside during the day to support learning. We know that feedback is the most significant instructional strategy to move students forward. It's not just Garrison and Ehrenhaus, but it's also Hattie's work that tells us that as well. So we need to take the opportunity to give feedback to students on that practice. We need to be creating opportunities for students to do the practice and for students to be formatively assessed. But we have to be able to trust the assessments that we're giving to students so that we can trust the data that we're collecting to guide our instructional practices and the feedback that we're giving students. So our assessments, we need to make sure that they're accurately measuring what we've intended to measure. So our work this year is really going to be surrounding creating opportunities for students to practice, creating formative assessments that align to learning targets, and then creating high quality assessments, formatively and summatively. So when we want to do that, there's some things that we need to think about in the process of creating high quality assessments. First of all, we need to make sure that we're thinking about what's the purpose of this assessment that I'm creating or going to use when you sit down to write it or you decide to give it to students. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why are we assessing? Who's going to use the information? That will help us to structure the questions or to select questions that we're going to use on the assessment. How are they going to use the information gathered from that? And what information will they need to know if students will need to move on or if students need to go back and relearn. The next piece is making sure that once we start selecting questions or we start writing questions, we need to make sure that these questions are aligned to the targets. We taught this, we need to make sure that the assessment is aligned. So are the targets, first of all, clear to us? Are they clear to students? Can we identify what kinds of targets we have? And then do our assessments and assessments reflect the targets students have had the opportunity to learn? So again, making sure that they're aligned. And last but not least, we want to make sure that we have a sound assessment design. So we have to make sure then that our methods are going to match the target. Oh, dang it. Sorry about that. One more. So that means taking a look at the type of target that we have and saying, okay, well, I'm asking students to create something, but I'm giving them a multiple choice question to answer that with and to show me that to demonstrate their learning. That wouldn't match up. That wouldn't be sound assessment design. So we have to make sure when we're selecting the types of questions that we're asking students that they also match the learning target. So these are all the different types of possible assessment methods that we could choose for students. But we want to make sure that they're aligned to the targets and that they're properly trying to measure what we've taught those students. So here's one way that you can use to make sure that your learning targets are aligned to your assessments. Again, this is one way. We're not expecting that everybody does this. It's just an option. So if you click here, you'll see that this is an assessment that is broken up into learning targets completely. So learning target number 1 has 6 questions that go underneath it. Learning target 2 has a few more, which means that this learning target is much bigger. Learning target number 3 has a few questions, and then there's a reading passage and then some reading skills questions that students have to answer. But you get the idea. So what you would do is you would copy and paste your learning targets from your unit plan into your assessments and then read your questions and then pull those questions underneath the targets that they go to. And then what you can do is you can kind of tell, okay, maybe you didn't ask any questions for a certain learning target on your assessment, which then means you're really not measuring what you taught the students. Or you might notice you have a whole bunch of questions under a certain learning target, and that was just a really small part of what you taught students. Really, there should be more questions under another learning target. So this kind of just gives you a nice visual of making sure that you're aligning those questions to learning targets. Then you can literally read the questions and make sure that they're asking students to do what you've taught them. Now, something else that's very beneficial is this answer sheet that went along with this assessment. So if you look, the answer sheet is also divided up into learning targets as well, which gives a very clear outline. You can see here there's writing that's involved in this assessment as well. It gives a very clear picture of what a student knows and is able to do. It's a really great communication tool to use, especially for retakes and students that would want to retake parts of an assessment. If you have your assessments broken up into learning targets, then what students can do here is they can see, well, I did really good in learning target number 1, but I'm not so good in learning target number 2. I really only need to retake learning target number 2. Now, this gives us a much clearer picture of what students' strengths and what students' weaknesses are, especially when we're thinking of students that might have to do something remedial in the summer. We can really pinpoint what are those things that they need to work on in the summer, or what are those things that they need to come back and relearn from us during the school year, of course. So anyways, this is just one way that you can do that. And then the last thing that we did as a group was we did an assessment audit. And this audit also gets at creating high quality assessments. So what you can do with this template is you fill in your learning targets on this side, and then you take a look at your assessment, and on your assessment, you determine which item numbers on the assessment align to that particular target. So like question 1 goes with this learning target right here. Question 3 might go with this learning target right here. And then what you would want to do is make sure that the questions are accurately aligned to the target, and circle ones that you think might not really be getting at the target, but you intended to get them at the target. Then you do a total points possible. Then you take a look at your items that you choose. How many multiple choice questions did you have that went with this learning target? How many short answer? How many essay? Maybe you had true false. You could add that in here if you wanted to, because you can make a copy of this. And then you take a look at the levels of your questions. Were they all level 1 questions? Were they all level 2? Were they all level 3? And so on and so forth. And this gives you a nice audit of your assessment, going back to those high quality pieces that we were talking about. So these are just 2 ways that you can use in your PLCs to check for high quality assessments. This is just one piece of what we're going to be doing this year. We're kind of chunking our assessment work little by little in each in-service, working on aligning those targets and creating high quality assessments. So the last thing that everybody did was a quick reflection on what they learned from doing that assessment audit on one of their assessments. I would encourage you in your PLCs to try one of the 2 methods and see how that helps create an understanding and a clear understanding if your assessments are measuring what you intended them to measure. So, if you have any questions, make sure that you bring them to the meeting. All right, thanks for your time.